Starting our recording. Welcome to day 5 of our summer training series on brain-based advocacy with older youth and teens. Today, we are going to be talking about the 3 R's of adolescent brain development. We're going to cover regulation, relationships, and rewards. So I am going to share my screen. We do have a bit to cover. We are going to be using breakout rooms today, so I'm going to jump right in. And so let's talk just a little bit about what the current science is telling us. So this is a little bit older book, but there's a researcher, a scientist named Lawrence Steinberg. And in his book, I think it's called The Age of Opportunities. And it's Age of Opportunities Lessons from the New Science of Adolescence. But there's really these kind of 3 major aspects of the brain that are especially active and undergoing changes during adolescence. So one thing we know is that, we often think of young people, of teens, of those adolescents, of not being able to understand risk or not thinking about risk or just not being able to think about consequences in the same way adults are. Now, what the science tells us is that's actually not true. Young people are just as equipped to evaluate and assess possible risk, right? If they're looking at a situation. The difference is that for adolescents and teenagers, there's this intensity, this heightened level of dopamine. Remember, dopamine's that kind of chemical neurotransmitter or chemical in our brain that helps us feel pleasure, helps us feel joy. So as an adolescent, we have this higher level of dopamine, kind of this dopamine flooding that's happening. And so what happens is the potential for this dopamine kind of outweighs adolescent consideration for the prospective negative outcomes. So it's not necessarily that young people are incapable of understanding risk or of looking at risk. It's really that this kind of dopamine, the center of their brain, is tugging them in this other direction. So that's what you see on your screen here, that these positive, when we have youth and teens having these positive experiences, it can really kind of fortify and solidify those healthy neural connections. That's where we see that the growing of that development of executive functioning. And it's really through those experiences. Remember, our adolescent brains learn through experiential, right? It's experiential learning. And so a lot of those same concepts can help stimulate healing and learning in the brains of the children that we're working. So one interesting thing about this science, or one conclusion that we can draw, or at least hypothesize about, is that is that a positive experience, right? Exposure to positive experiences. And this could mean, kind of happy, exciting things. It could mean times where a young person is just feeling fulfilled or successful or accomplished, or just feeling content. Kind of those positive, safe experiences actually contradict negative expectations of a child who has experienced trauma. So when we can kind of create these, what we in the law, what we in the policy call normalized experiences, these kind of positive experiences, not only is that what teens are wanting and asking for and what they need, but it's what they need for their brain development. So we can kind of offset when we are advocating for this kind of tapping into this natural propensity of the brain to lean towards that experiential learning. So it's kind of a cool thing that we can deduce from the research. So, let's think about this in terms of crisis. So, young people are definitely learning skills to think critically, right? They don't have that full prefrontal cortex just yet, still working out how to regulate emotions. But they can actually make studied decisions when they can consult with others and when they have enough time and when they're calm. So when they're in a calm environment, when they're in a calm place, we can actually talk through these things. This is the science that supports the urging to include teens and young people in their court cases. Because a lot of times we say, oh no, they shouldn't be in there because it'll be hard for them to hear something or they won't be able to understand. And a lot of times, if we can apply what we know about development and what we know about brain science, there's actually a way for us to do that that's really safe and actually helps that child on the path towards healing and regaining control, dignity, all that stuff. So let's talk through this concept called hot cognition and cold cognition. So when young people, sorry, I want to make sure I'm not missing any chats here. When young people are making these kind of steady decisions, and they can, when they, I think there's a typo there, but when they can consult with others and they're in this calm environment, this is what we call cold cognition. And then let's look at the opposite side of this, hot cognition. So this is when young people may struggle a little bit if they're feeling time pressured, if they're perhaps emotionally aroused for some reason or another, or they're subject to peer pressure. This is that hot cognition. So they're not making as clear decisions. So remember, I mentioned that the adolescent brain is equipped just as much as a fully formed adult brain to assess risk. It's that there's these other influences that sometimes impact the decision that is made. And that's what I'm talking about, this hot cognition. So either there's pressure, they're feeling this tug of this dopamine flooding that's coming. And so kind of the dopamine surge outweighs the risk in their mind, or maybe there's an outside influence of peer pressure, all of those types of things. And it gets even more complicated with our kids when we're talking about adding trauma, right, to all of this, and trauma reactivity to all of this, or possibly, even though we might observe the child or the teen to be in a calm environment, when I say calm, it's that they're experiencing it, that their experience of that environment is calm. So if this is a child who has been moved 6 or 7 times, even though they're in a stable, calm environment right now, in their mind, they might be waiting for the other shoe to drop. So that's when you see teens that never seem to settle in, right? They are always kind of hypervigilant. Or maybe there's some self-sabotaging type behaviors that are going on. That's because while we are seeing this as it's calm, it's stable, this is a stable environment, that's not what's happening inside of their brain. And so I really like the terms just cold and hot cognition, because it kind of takes all the technical stuff out of it and just really talks through being able to make those steady, calm, calculated decisions. And then, on the other side of that, having all this kind of messiness and trying to make those decisions. So we're going to go into quick partners and breakouts. So you got a quick little brain science update, but we're going to go into some discussion questions. And so as you're heading into those, I want you to just kind of think about a few things or have a few things in mind. One is think about, how did you learn important life skills as a teen? So think back to when you were a teenager. How did you learn, kind of whatever you think was were some of those really important life skills, whether it's conflict resolution, how to build relationships, or even maybe more nuts and bolts of like how to balance a checkbook. How did you learn those important life skills? And so that's the first discussion question that you'll ask when I send you to your breakout room. And the next was, what was a risk that you took or a new experience that you tried that you learned from? Remember, risk doesn't always mean danger when we're talking about these types of things. So, what's a risk you took or kind of something new you tried that you learned from as an adolescent or as a teen? So I'm going to split you into pairs, and we won't have a ton of time. We'll just have a few minutes in each of these, and I'll have to move. Okay, I think there will be one group of 3. I think that's the way the math is going to work out. Or maybe not. It looks like we have Deb just added here. So if we can get Deb in, we'll add her in with Rochelle. So just going to give you a couple of minutes in your breakouts and just kind of share between the two of you, and then we'll come back. All right. Just one second. I want to make sure I get everyone added here. Okay. So Deb, you just signed on. We are getting ready to head out into breakout rooms. You will be with Stephanie, so I'm sure she can catch you up. But we're asking two important questions. How did you learn important life skills as a teen? And what was a risk or a new experience you tried that you learned from as a teen? So you're going to have about 3 minutes, and I'll give you the 2-minute warning.
Back.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. So I know that was a quick little breakout, but I hope you got at least a chance to think about it and share a little bit. You know, part of what we're doing is kind of reflecting on our own experiences, you know, through our own lived experiences as, you know, all former teenagers ourselves, and using that to somewhat ground what, you know, what when we think about the teens that we work with. You know, and this is said pretty often if you've ever been to a conference or to an event with, you know, with any foster care alumni group or any kind of self-advocacy that happens. One of the most frequent, you know, I hear two things a lot. One is nothing about us without us. That's a phrase I hear all the time when I'm working with alumni. And the second is, you know, we need to give teens in foster care the room to safely fail, right? Because we all, you know, everyone as teenagers, as young adults, we all experience those failures, and that's how we learn. That's that experiential learning component that we've been talking about. But with teens in foster care, so often that mistake, that failure, you know, that whatever it is, can sometimes compromise their entire future, right? It might be the reason cited for an adoptive placement backing out, or it could be the reason for a move from one, you know, maybe to a residential facility, you know. So there, the decisions that a teenager in foster care make inherently seem to carry a little bit more weight than those of teenagers who aren't in foster care. And obviously there's shades of that, right? There are probably teens out there who have never been involved in the foster care system, who have so much more responsibility than they really should probably be having. But it's just one of the, you know, it's an interesting thing to think about when we consider the implications here. So I mentioned that we're going to be discussing 3 major aspects of the brain that are especially active and undergoing changes during adolescence. And so those are the structures in our brain that assist with regulation. Remember, that's the combination of your limbic system. So your limbic system is kind of that fire alarm, smoke alarm of your brain, and then that frontal lobe, that decision center of our brain. So you have regulation, relationships, and rewards. And we're going to talk about each of these separately and talk about what we can do as child advocates to assist in these areas, to foster growth in these 3 areas. So first up, we are going to listen to Naila Enos discuss regulation. It's a really quick audio clip. If for some reason the sound doesn't work, flag me down.
Regulation. I remember a time where the Department of Family and Children's Services came to my school, pulled me out of class, and informed me that I would be moving to another placement. I remember that day like it was yesterday because I was so distraught and embarrassed. School was my safe haven, and to have the only place where I felt comfortable being disrupted was infuriating. I returned to class, and all I could think about is that I'm moving, meaning I'm leaving all of my friends and teachers behind. With all of those emotions of sadness and anger, I ended up running away from school. The situation could have been avoided or had better outcomes if they just told me outside of school and given me the opportunity to call someone from my support system, such as my grandmother, to help with the transition. This is how regulation can show up in the work.
So that's just kind of a quick clip, but I think that it, again, explains that sometimes we as adults involved in children's lives make decisions and plan things in a way that makes it easier for us to manage it, right? It kind of minimizes the risk of disruptions, all of those things. And we're really not necessarily taking into account the impact that the way things unfold, right? The decision is the decision, right? It sounds like, this young person was being moved no matter what, was going to be living somewhere different. So now we could kind of argue about that decision, and we may or may not be able to change the way that that decision is made, if it's appropriate to change the way that that decision is made. But certainly we have opportunities to, okay, if the train is rolling, how can we make this as safe and productive and smooth and least traumatizing as possible? So, in this case, this young person shared that she ran away. Again, right, there was all this outside pressure that perhaps if she didn't have all that outside pressure and all of that going on, all of that hot cognition going on, maybe she would have thought, this isn't a good idea. Running away is not a good idea for me. So in what ways, I'll just have one or two of you share, either unmute or in the chat box, but in what ways can you support young people in making kind of those thoughtful decisions in really stressful or really high pressure situations? What's just one thing, big or small, that you could do?
Maybe talk to them about consequences, about, the best way to proceed, and, what the consequences are if they approach it differently, or if, try to get them to open up about how they're feeling about it and then talk that through with them.
Yeah, I think, having those really authentic, really honest conversations about, hey, here are all the ways that this can go. That's a technique I use a lot when I'm working with teens, as just kind of talking through things. I really try not to beat around the bush and just, approach things very directly and say, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm worried about, let's kind of work through this together. And that, restores that, remember, that restoration of dignity to a teenager.
One of the things that I have used is kind of involving them in the process. I've had kids before that have needed to be moved, and sometimes they wanted it and sometimes they didn't. But to say, here's what I'm working on. This is my obligation to you pretty much. And here's what I'm going to do, and kind of lay that out, and then explain what I expect their part to be, what their role in that is. This is what I expect from you, and we'll communicate, and I think I've had good success with that. Just getting them involved in that process, whether they want to or they don't. It gives them a sense of responsibility, and they kind of feel like they have, an obligation to me, and I have an obligation to them.
Yeah, I think, again, pulling that, there's so much to be said about when we afford someone basic dignity, regardless of how old they are. There's so much to be said of the power of that, right? Of even if this is an uncomfortable situation or a situation that you don't want to participate in, I value and honor your existence as a human being enough to include you in the decisions that we're making and in the process. And we're going to work through it together. I think there's just a lot of power in that. Catching up on the chat here, try to eliminate other stressors or variables if we have control of them before talking about those new changes. Yeah, showing up at school might have been unavoidable, but certainly not ideal, right? To hear that from the child's perspective. Now, let's think about this from the adult who went in and said, hey, you're leaving at school. You're going to be moved. They were probably thinking this is like a safe place. This is a controlled setting. You know, we'll be able to, there will be a support system around her because she's at school, you know, all these things. Now, flip that. How did it feel to this young person? They took away my only safe place. It feels like they took the rug out from under me. So yeah, thinking through that. And as Rochelle suggests, trying to eliminate those other variables if we can control them. Stephanie shares kind of making a pro and con list. I think that lines up with what kind of Tanya was saying of just kind of talking through things very diplomatically and practically. Yep, encourage if then thinking, kind of planning ahead. I think that's a great strategy, and it does help eliminate some of that feeling of being blindsided. That's a good suggestion, Nancy. Rhonda shares, provide a safe environment and give them an opportunity to approach the news in their time with the support that they need. Absolutely. You know, two of us could be sitting in the exact same room and get the same news and might react to it very differently. And we might need different types of support as we process that news. Great. Thank you, everyone. So I think we've talked about most of this, but I'll just kind of go through. Regulation does not happen within a vacuum. Regulation really does develop in concert and in the context of relationships with others. So we're not just going to be looking at a teenager and say, okay, we've got to get them regulated, because that's not going to work, right? We got to think of regulation, relationships, and reward almost as like a three-legged stool. We really need all three of those pieces, and we need to give attention to all three of those factors in order to really help a child through a difficult situation. I already mentioned, but you know, young people tend to experience this hyper arousal in the brain regions that are sensitive to like social acceptance and rejection. So they can be particularly vulnerable to peer pressure or to what we as an adult might say is overreacting. So with the young person we just heard from, you know, has this kind of embarrassed reaction to people coming to school. We as the adult might say, gosh, she's overreacting because nobody in the school knew what was going on. But we have to remember that she has this hyper arousal in these parts of her brain just due to her age and development. So that's going to seem a lot bigger to her than it does to us. Adolescents are also very in tune to emotional cues. So the typically neurotypical adolescent tends to have a more keen observation of facial expressions, for example. I think we've talked about all of these, but you know, we've been talking about this, but young people tend to learn more because of that experiential learning and the importance of relationships. They tend to learn more when they're around their peers and when they're, you know, with their friends, just because they're taking those risks together, they're, you know, kind of trying out new things together, testing those boundaries. And that's a great opportunity for kind of brain wrestling and learning. So we are going to go back into our breakout rooms, and I have two more questions to ask. And so thinking through your older adolescents, so those older teen years, who was important to you? And what did support look like for you in your adolescence? And so I'm not asking anybody to disclose anything, but we're talking just in general terms. What did this look like for you? So we'll go back into those breakout rooms again really quickly. And I think we might have one group of 3. All right, so you'll get that 2-minute warning, so you'll be able to wrap up, but expect about 3 minutes total.
Recording.
Hi, everyone. I must have had a lot to talk about in that one. It seemed like I had to kick you all out and bring you back in. So welcome back. One of the reasons I wanted you to have this discussion question and your partners is because, as I was mentioning, we can really take advantage of this influence of that social attunement that teens tend to have at this time, right? Because there's such a propensity for that social acceptance, and we kind of use that to regulate our own emotions when we're teenagers. So we can somewhat use that information to our advantage when we're supporting a teen, because we know that when we are helping and supporting teens to have positive learning experiences immersed within their peers, and we can kind of create this, nurturing or positive environment, because we know that when a teen is with peers in a positive way, not when I'm not talking about traumatic experiences, but in positive ways, it actually kind of triggers that reward center of the brain. So we have that dopamine surge, the serotonin surge. So we're creating this feedback loop that reinforces learning. And if you remember back from a couple of weeks ago about the synaptic pruning, that kind of myelination that can occur, it's what I like to call, if it fires together, it wires together. So we can kind of create these, reinforce this learning this way. So anybody have any questions so far before we start talking a little bit more about relationships? Okay. So we are going to hear from Naila again, and she's going to talk about relationships.
Relationships. Relationships are essential to surviving in foster care. While in care, I made my own little family, because being in care can be very lonely, especially being taken away from the family you have known all your life. In building relationships while in care, I attached to those I trusted. But when they left, for example, when I had to leave a foster parent due to multiple reasons, like it being a temporary placement, I would detach automatically in order to protect myself from getting hurt. I would try my best to avoid my feelings getting involved at a placement. The consequence of this is that it led me to engage in unhealthy activities, because I would bottle my emotions or rely on my peer suggestions, which weren't always the best. Thus, relationships is a key factor when it comes to young people. But on the other hand, I think the best relationships I have built were from those who I've met in foster care. It is funny how most of my group home staff that I still have relationships with now saw something beyond my behavior. They believed that I had a future, and that during my time in care was me going through my emotions of dealing with my trauma. Making those connections were very important to me, because now these people are here to celebrate monumental moments, such as going to prom, my high school graduation, and my college graduation. I would not be the woman I am today without the relationships I have made while in care. This is why relationships are essential in the work.
So, let's just kind of think through what are ways that we can work with young people to ensure that they have the benefit of those lifelong relationships and those permanent connections. So you can use the chat, unmute yourself. And then what have you found helpful or meaningful in strengthening relationships with young people? Anyone have some wisdom to share?
I think what was helpful in my dealings with the one teen that I had a couple years ago was that I shared stories from my own youth and growing up, and some of the things that were positive, but also some of the things that wound up being negative for me, and the things that I thought I learned from and how I learned from them. So just giving specific examples so that we had more of a connection, and she knew more about me, so that she understood that I went through struggles as well, and how I dealt with those.
So kind of finding that common ground as a relationship building tool. Does anyone else say, oh, I see something in the chat here.
I found an aunt who probably lived 40 minutes outside of Toledo, who was able to get cleared through CSB so that she couldn't care for the girls because she had kids of her own. She had their cousins, but she had a beautiful property and was concerned about the girls. And she was willing to see them on the weekend so that they could have the cousin get-togethers and the barbecues and swim in the ponds and, well, not swimming, but do those types of things. She helped foster the cousin relationships.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but so often we're focused on placement, right? Because that's kind of the biggest thing in front of us is where is everybody going to live? And so slowing that down a little bit is one thing we can definitely do, and saying, okay, you know, this aunt is not really going to be an option for placement, but how can this aunt be supportive? So that's great. Suggestions from the chat are active listening and kind of really caring about what they have to say and giving them that support. The importance of continuity to strengthen relationships, and, you know, being there during kind of the good times as well as the bad, and accepting that person during all situations. Great. One thing I've noticed when I talk with teens, or just really, and even adults, when I say, you know, who's supportive to you? That seems so big. And so when you really break it down and say, you know, when you've had a really great day, if something really great's happened, you've achieved something, who's the person that you would call to tell about that, or that you would want to call to tell about that, to know that? Or on the other hand, you know, when I'm talking with young moms or something, I'm like, if something happens in the middle of the night and you're freaking out, who's the person you call for middle of the night advice? Who's that support person? As a, you know, we have to recognize we use complicated language sometimes within our juvenile justice and child welfare system. So sometimes we have to use a little bit more common language to really arrive at a thoughtful conversation.
One more thing, Winnie. When I think about my daughter's close friends, they're all people that she met when she started either softball or volleyball when she was really young. And I think it's so important that if the opportunities exist, that we grab them and get the kids involved in extracurricular things that they're really interested in, so they can form relationships with those children.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think any of those, you know, if anyone was ever involved in youth sports or the band or 4-H or FFA, you know, any of those, you know, kind of the Y, any of those types of groups or organizations, those kind of form those lifelong relationships. And even if the actual friendship, right, maybe you lose touch with that person, we're teaching the how of relationships by doing those types of things, which is sometimes just as important. So I want to talk a kind of a cool little tool or technique. Some of you have probably seen a version of this already. But if you're working with a teen and they're having trouble coming up with kind of who are the people that are really supportive to them, because maybe it's hard if they're trying to quantify. I know a lot of you probably know the five people who can help, where you kind of go through and you want one person for each finger that could help if a child needed something. This one's a little bit different. It's a little more advanced. But the way you would use this, and you can do this for yourself if you have a blank piece of paper. So you're going to start with just one smaller circle. And in that circle, you're going to write down all the people who are closest to you. This is your absolute inner circle. The people who, you know, kind of know the secrets. So that's your inner circle. And so you can do this for yourself if you want. But you can do this with teens too. You can kind of say, all right, let's talk about who's in that inner circle. And then we move out, you know, after they write their names in there, we move out, and that's kind of those people, or even maybe places. Maybe it's not a specific person, but it's the time that they went to XYZ high school. Those, you know, don't quite make it into that inner circle, but are still really important. Then we would have them write their names, places, things like that in there. And then the outer circle are those people and places in their network, but the people and places that they wouldn't go to often. So think of that as that kind of security net. So, you know, I've done this with teens, and a lot of times that inner circle is maybe one or two friends, maybe a relative is in there. And then that second circle are maybe some of the placement providers that they've known over the years, maybe their counselor, And then the outer circle might be more of the systems people. So it might be people like me, court people, or the children's services people, right? That they know they can count on, but they're not necessarily their go-to when they're kind of really needing that emotional support. And it's not our job to judge their circle of support. So if you're working with a child and they put you in the outer circle, this isn't a competition for you to try to figure out how to get into their inner circle. But really, this is a tool to help a young person understand and just think about, almost like they're mining their own lives for who those supported people and places can be in their lives. And this is one useful tool when we're talking about planning, but also can be a useful tool when we're thinking about safety, right? If someone in the inner circle or a place in the inner circle is a person that maybe we've identified to be incredibly dangerous, then that's going to shape the way that we work with that teen or young person. We're not going to draw any grand conclusions from this. This is really an internal exercise. But it does give us something to think about. And again, that when we talk about trauma, it's not how we see it or we observe it, it's how they experience it. And that can be very different than the expectations that we bring to the table. So try this out, file it away as a tool that you have in your belt. It's super easy to do. You don't need anything fancy to sit down and do this with a young person or even an adult. I've done versions of this when I've worked with parents as well. Oops. Okay. So when we talk about rewards, we know that rewards really need to extend beyond the concept of like incentives. That's not what I'm talking about. So we're not talking about any of those systems where it's like, if you have 5 good days in a row, then you get something out of the treasure chest. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about brain rewards, that internal mechanism within our brain. So peer approval, acceptance, praise, all of these things trigger that flood of dopamine into the brain and can kind of help reinforce actions and reinforce behavior. So it doesn't have to be something really, really grand. It needs to be genuine. It needs to be authentic. Think about maybe a small person, like a young child that and they draw a picture, right? They draw some picture and they bring it up to you and they're just so excited when you kind of make a fuss over the picture that they've drawn, and right, you're praising them and you're reinforcing that. You're building resilience in them. You're establishing that they're competent, that if they work hard, they can achieve this. And that's that dopamine flood, that serotonin flood. Remember that the dopamine is a neurotransmitter or a brain chemical that helps us feel that pleasure, helps us feel joy. So we kind of crave that as human beings, to kind of continue getting that injection of that. So when we over time reinforce through praise or reinforce through acceptance, then we kind of trigger that part of the brain, and that can be really, really helpful. And remember, that's how that's how young people learn. I'm having trouble with my slides here. So let's hear from Naila again. She's going to talk about rewards and share her experience about that, and then we'll come back together.
Rewards. Reward-based learning is not always materialistic. The prize of communication is a reward in itself. For example, I ran away a lot while in care. No one ever asked me why I ran away to one foster parent. She listened and found my reasoning for running away was that I was always trying to beat my foster parents to the punch when it came to kicking me out of my placement. In that moment, my foster parent explained that there would be consequences for me running away, such as no allowance for the week or curfew being cut down, but she would never hold kicking me out as a punishment. We even came up with a little agreement that if I had to move because of my behavior, that we would have a conversation about it. That was so refreshing because I never experienced that from any other placements. This is rewards.
So it's an interesting concept, right? The way that we tend to assess teenage behavior, and kind of sometimes the way that we assess it or the way that our system is designed, that makes it really challenging to kind of carry out the way that we want it to work. So, it sounds like Naila had a pretty insightful foster parent who wasn't going to hold up kind of a placement change over her head, so to speak. But I think, those of us that have been doing this work for a while, we recognize the realities that, a lot of times, particularly when we start talking about maybe residential treatment facilities, there's kind of this line in the sand that gets drawn. And when that line is crossed, for whatever reason, even if we understand why this is happening, then we find ourselves in this situation. So it creates this kind of internal, this unintended consequence for the teen that, I'm getting moved because I'm bad. I'm getting moved because X, Y, and Z is wrong with me, right? All of those things that can kind of get internalized. And so I say that to say, I recognize that can be a challenge. And what I hope as over the course of, the next month and a half that we have together on our Tuesday sessions is that we can chip away at small things that we can do and we can control to help make things a little bit better. And we can definitely take advantage of the science behind the way that we have this injection of dopamine, or this flooding of dopamine when a teen or when a young person is experiencing that feedback reward. Another just kind of an interesting sidebar to this. A lot of you can probably think back to, your favorite song from when you were a teenager, or a favorite experience or a movie you watched or something. And when that song maybe comes on the radio, you're immediately taken back, right to where you were when you heard that song and all of that. It's actually this dopamine flooding that's responsible for that reminiscence feeling that we have. And that's, again, the marrying together of that regulation, the relationships, and the rewards that we see in adolescent brains. So that's just kind of a fun side fact, but we can continue to take advantage of that, because we know that the experiences that a teen has in those formative teenage years can carry on well into adulthood, whether it's, something as small as a song coming on the radio and triggering a memory, all the way up to, facing a conflict as a 24-year-old and being able to rely on some of those myelinated processes in order to be able to effectively manage and stay regulated during that, and kind of resort back, get ourselves calmed down so that we can, use those cold cognition techniques when we're working through a situation later on. So it's kind of interesting, I think. So let's talk. I know we typically would have a case study today, but we're running a little short on time. So I think what we will do is we'll start with the case study next week, but let's wrap up with this question here. How are the systems that we work in set up to respond to young people who engage in this very appropriate experiential learning, or what we call risk taking? So what do we think when you're saying, okay, Jenny, I get it, the brain science, this is how teens learn. They take these risks, they do these experiential learning, they do all this stuff, but that doesn't always work in the real world, Jenny. So what are your thoughts on this?
I think the systems are set up to minimize risk taking. I mean, I don't think they want them to take risks.
Yep, I know, I agree, especially the, kind of risks that we don't have much control over, right? Absolutely.
But I also feel like there might be punishment involved, or a consequence immediately. Like, are the systems really set up to, I don't want to say to deal with them, but I feel like everyone's so overloaded that immediately there could be a punishment. Yeah,
I agree with you. I think that's kind of what Rochelle was alluding to as well, is that we kind of have this consequence-based system when it comes to risk. And remember, risk doesn't always necessarily mean, we're not always necessarily talking about danger. So I know we often think of risk as, getting ready to jump off a cliff or something. But, risk can also just mean that experiential learning. A risk might be saying yes when someone asks you to the prom, right? So that could be kind of a risk of, all right, I'm putting myself out there, I'm going to go to this dance. And that's kind of a healthy risk that happens and that we grow from. Or, just things like that, saying yes to being the leader of the student council, that's a risk taking as well. So I just gave you two examples, the prom and student council. How likely is that a teenager who's been bouncing around from home to home or facility to facility is going to have the chance to engage in those types of risks that I just mentioned, prom or the city council?
Probably slim.
Yeah, either from disruptions or maybe a rule, maybe they're placed in a facility that doesn't allow them, or maybe there's not an opportunity to engage in those types of experiences. Maybe they've moved quite a bit, and so they've not really settled into their new high school. So they're just maybe not feeling like they can get involved in those types of things. So it's not always necessarily kind of a bad, it's not necessarily that the system is this big, bad, mean wolf, but sometimes it's just the nature of it limits our opportunity to support and foster these types of risk experiences. So we have just a few minutes left, but what's one thing that, can anyone think of something we could do to engage or foster those types of behaviors or those types of experiences for young people? Yep, Rochelle says just encouraging an extracurricular. Absolutely. Yeah, and working hard to make it a priority. I can't tell you the number of times I've been involved with, we're trying to figure out visitation or trying to figure out appointments, and the child will say, well, that'll cause me to miss my soccer practice. And the adults involved will say, well, this is more important than soccer, or this is more important than soccer. And, I don't disagree. There are some things that I think, obviously are prioritized, but we have to remember the magnitude of and the importance of those types of activities in adolescent brain development, whether it's soccer or piano practice or the drama, getting involved in the school play, all of those things. Not only do they foster that kind of relationship building, but it also helps us build healthy brains. So sometimes as a CASA, we might just be saying, no, it's actually really important that this child be free to participate in the school play. Like, this is a risk that they're taking. This is an important thing that they're trying. It's going to be good for them. All of the things that we know. And maybe just what we can do is just advocate that they be able to do that and that it be prioritized. So if they're placed somewhere where maybe the foster parent isn't able to do the transportation or whatever the issue is, maybe really advocating strongly on behalf of that young person for them to be able to participate in that. So that's just a little thing, as much as I'd like to change the entire landscape of what we offer, sometimes we have to look at those kind of smaller things that we can do for the child that's right in front of us today. Yep. Rochelle shares kind of any experience-based learning, looking for those, taking advantage of them, strengthening kind of community bonds. Absolutely. And any, neat or interesting experiences, right? Whether it's, if there's some, a music event happening, maybe, those types of things, just anything that kind of fosters and builds that, if possible, if those things are possible. Right. Well, we have about 2 minutes to spare. So for next week, since we didn't get to Marie's case study, we could have squeezed it in, but I really want to give us a good 15 minutes to work on that. We will start next week with Marie's case study. You actually already have it available on Google Classroom if you want to read it ahead of it in advance. And then we'll break up into small groups first thing next week and talk about that. And then next week is when we begin discussing trauma. So we've touched a little bit on it, but we're going to talk about it a little more intensely for the next few weeks. Any questions before we sign off today? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for bouncing in and out of breakouts and all of that and bearing with me. I appreciate it. And I appreciate how engaged all of you are. It makes it really fun for me to do this. So I will see you all next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.